Hey guys, it is Tamara. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk to you about what's called the cognitive model, and I want to show you how this impacts you as you're watching the riots and the protests in regards to the George Floyd murder. So I think the cognitive model is going to help you understand why you're feeling a certain way in response. You know, I've gotten a lot of emails, tweets, and messages even on my voicemail, my office voicemail, about the George Floyd protests. And I think that this has triggered a lot of emotions and thought processes in people. And I find it interesting that as one of the largest civil rights movements in the world, right? It's a revolutionary change. It really has flipped the minds and the hearts of people who maybe once thought a different way at one time. It's just beautiful. But I also think at the same time, it has really caused a lot of emotions, right? So I want to talk about the cognitive model and how that impacts us as we, kind of sit back and observe, or as we even engage in the protests, because some of my clients have engaged in the protests, and it's impacted them. It's affected them. It's a grieving period, but it's also a period to make some real lasting changes. So I want to tell you how this affects you and how you can kind of perceive things from a different perspective using the cognitive model. So thank you so much for coming back to my channel. For those who are subscribed, and for those who are new, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button right over here so that you can stick around with us and be a part of our growing and validating community. The benefits for you in today's video is that I'm going to highlight the cognitive model, and I want to show you what happens to us and how our brain interprets exactly what we're looking at. So, in a couple of videos ago, it's been a while. I've gone through a lot over the past few months, so I've kind of lost track. But I think it might have been at the beginning of the year, January, maybe December, November. I talked a lot about the brain. I talked a lot about what's called CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And I focused on the cognitive model and how this model impacts how we see ourselves and how we see others and how we perceive reality. Now, the whole idea behind cognitive behavior therapy is that whatever we process or attempt to process in our mind, it has a way of affecting our emotions. And when our emotions are affected, then it begins to affect our behavior, right? So, in some, clinics, a therapist may refer to it as the ABC model, the antecedents, behaviors, and the consequences. But really, I'm talking about this model right over here. And it's the thought, feelings, and behavior model. And what we're looking at is you have a thought, right? You're dealing with a cognition, a thought, and then it impacts your emotions, and then it causes you to behave a certain way. And so let me help you clearly understand how the cognitive model is impacting these protests and these riots. Okay, let me get a clipboard. So some of my clients and some of the people that consult with me, they told me that they've been thinking and processing things. And, that processing and thinking and like throwing ideas around has really caused them to feel overwhelmed by everything. The way that they think about it and the way that their brain interprets it is what is causing the stress. And so this has kind of kept some of my clients feeling depressed and helpless and dealing with learned helplessness. So let me write this down for you. I want to show you guys a model, and I want you to kind of follow along with me in this video. It may be helpful that you utilize this tool, because then you can utilize it in other areas of your life as well. So this is called the cognitive model. And the first thing that you have, okay, is an event. Once the event happens, so let's say the protest, right? The protest is the event, and I'm going to write that down. So the protest is the event, okay? So you have an event, and then you have your brain, okay? So the event, the brain, and the brain is basically trying to interpret the situation, all right? And I'm going to show you how I'm doing this in 1 second. Okay, and then we have the resulting emotion, which is most likely going to be anxiety. Okay, so let me show you what I'm doing here. So then that way, you can follow along with me. Okay, so here's what we're looking at. Okay, So we have an event, and the event is the protest or the riots, we can say, okay? The protests or the riots. That event, that situation triggers the brain. And either it's going to trigger the amygdala, which is not logical, it's not intelligent, it's not rational, right? It's all reactive. The amygdala is the emotional center of the brain, and it reacts to interpretations of threat and danger, right? So we have the situation and the event that happens. Then that situation or event triggers the brain or the amygdala or the cortex to try to interpret the event. Now the cortex is going to interpret the event using logistics and logical thinking and reasoning, excuse me. The cortex is also where our decision making occurs, right? It's that executive functioning. The prefrontal cortex, which is right in the front of the brain, it's behind the forehead, and it helps us process what's going on in our environment. It has a lot to do with personality, impulse control, and decision making. So when a situation or an event happens, then it triggers the brain. It's going to trigger the amygdala, which is going to interpret a threat and react. It's reactive. And then it's going to trigger the cortex, which is less reactive, right? It's a little bit more logical and rational. So it's going to try to interpret. And so once that happens, once the brain begins to interpret the situation, then the result or the consequence is the emotion. And that emotion may be anxiety. Okay. So this is the cognitive model. You have the event. You have the event or the situation, then you have the brain, which is the amygdala or the cortex that's going to try to interpret the situation, and then you have the resulting emotion from that interpretation. So if we use this cognitive model to explain the protest, here's what's going to happen. The event that happened was George Floyd's murder. That was the event in the situation. Okay, the brain of those who watched the news, watched the video, saw the YouTube clip, saw the camera on the police, whatever, their brain interpret things, most likely the amygdala saw threat. And the threat was, well, what if this is going to happen to me in the future? What if this is going to happen to one of my loved ones? What if this is going to happen to my husband or my brother or my uncle? What if this is going to continue to happen to my friends and those who deserve freedom and equality and those who have lives and children and wives to go to in the morning and the next day, in the next few hours, right? What if this is going to happen to me? So the brain begins to interpret the situation. Okay, George Floyd's death the brain begins to interpret that situation, and the amygdala identifies a threat, and the threat is what if? That's the threat. What if? And then the cortex begins to interpret the event as, we've been going through this as people of color for centuries. We've also been going through this as a society for centuries. Police brutality has always been an issue for centuries, right? And then you begin to look for facts, and then you begin to look for situations that are similar. That is the cortex doing its work, right? It's interpreting, it's kind of engaging in decision making, and it's controlling impulses, and it's really helping you to rationalize. And then the resulting emotion from George Floyd's death was anxiety and depression and grief. And that is the result of the brain's interpretation of the situation. Now, there's also another part of the brain that I want you to be aware of. Hold on, guys. Okay, so here's the other part of this that I want you to be aware of. It's called the Corpus Callosum. Okay, and the Corpus Callosum? Oh, I bet you I botched that up. I bet you. The Corpus Callosum, and I probably have this backwards. Forgive me if I do. I'm going to put the Corpus Callosum right over here so that you can see it. So you know what I'm talking about. But this is basically the entire brain. The Corpus Callosum, okay, is the fibers in the middle of the cortex or the brain that controls communication between these two hemispheres, okay? So this is definitely not the left since I'm looking at it now, or maybe it is. I don't know. It's upside down. It's been a long day. I really don't know. But the left and the right side of the brain, this is called the right hemisphere. This is called the left hemisphere. Okay, the right hemisphere, this is called the left hemisphere. Now, the left hemisphere is the logical reasoning side that tries to figure out what's going on and why George Floyd was murdered, why we're having riots, why are innocent people losing their businesses, right? Why is this happening? That is the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain is the more romantic, artistic, creative side, and it's going to try to figure out how can we create unity and peace and happiness and joy and healing because of all of this grief, okay? So these two sides of the brain are also a part of the equation because they are helping us to interpret what is going on. And it's really helping us to figure out, right, where we've gone wrong and what needs to change, okay? So the brain is doing a lot of the work, even though the heart is hurting, right? The heart is hurting, but the brain is doing a lot of the work. And, you know, I'm really hoping that all the civil rights movements that are happening in today's society is really going to set the stage for a better future. I don't know. I just know that we cannot stay here, right? We have to move from point A to point B. And we certainly do not want to regress back to the early 60s, the early 70s, 80s, 90s, where prejudice and racism and discrimination and a lack of understanding ruled the earth, right? You know, it kept everybody stuck. It kept us in a box. It kept us imprisoned, and we do not want to be in that prison anymore. So, you know, I think those of us as a whole, right, as a human race, as a feeling human being, we really need a change, and we can't stay here. So I'm hoping that all of these protests, all the knowledge, all the talks, all the YouTube videos, all the supporters, we can pull together and utilize all this information to bring about a better ending. Thank you so much for being with me in this video today, guys. Please give it a thumbs up if it was helpful to you, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you can stick around with us and be a part of this channel. Thank you so much for my new subscribers and for all of you who have shared your experiences during the protests. Thank you so much, and thank you for fighting for what's right. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.